Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Could we just ask you to take a seat? We've got a few more seats. There's two here in the second row. Okay, well, welcome to tonight's presentation on a very snowy evening. Thank you so much for braving the elements to be here, and it's good to see such a good turnout. I know anecdotally at least a few people told me that they were planning to attend but are going to watch online instead, so we, I'm sure, have a good crowd watching online, and welcome to all of them as well. So this is a presentation tonight by the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. And I like to open with our mission statement, which is promoting historical literacy through research, education, and engagement in the public square. And these lectures, which we've had, I guess, 4 so far this year, are part of the education component, I guess, and maybe even the engagement in the public square. But tonight we're very happy to have with us John Ibbitson, and I'll tell you a little bit about John. I'll just read a few select bits from the bio that is in the book that we're going to give a copy away of. John Ibbitson is one of Canada's best-known and most respected journalists and authors. And he held the position of Washington Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, which I think would give him some insight into the things that are going on in our world right now, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that, if not in the talk, but maybe in the Q&A, which John has agreed to do for a while after he gives his talk. He was, as I say, the Washington Bureau Chief. He was the Ottawa Bureau Chief, the chief political writer and the writer at large, and he's been the author of some dozen books, mostly related to Canadian politics and history, including 2 that are available for sale tonight. One, which is the subject of tonight's talk, The Duel, Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the Making of Modern Canada. And the other one, which I didn't bring with me, is Breaking Point, The New Big Shifts Putting Canada at Risk, and that was co-authored with Darrell Bricker. And both of those books are available for sale tonight. The Duel is $28, and the other one co-authored with Darrell Bricker is $40. And I know that John would be very happy to sign them for you afterwards. So, I also wanted to read a couple of quotes from some of the things that people have said about this book. And the reason is that all 3 of them are people who are affiliated with the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. So John English is the author of a biography of Lester Pearson. John English, his quote that I wanted to read was, together, these 2 complex, ambitious, highly intelligent, and flawed men were principal architects of the more tolerant, generous, and open Canada that exists today. And then a quick quote from Robert Bothwell. John Ibbitson examines the parallel lives of these 2 men, showing how their fraught relationship helped create the institutions and the policies that still govern Canada today. And finally, a quote by J.D.M. Stewart, who is in the room and is going to be thanking John later on. John Ibbitson has brought life and relevance back to the history of John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson. It is a textured and incisive account that includes not only the history of these 2 men, but also the significant moments and trends that shaped the nation over decades and continue to today. So, I am going to ask John to draw a number, and there are no numbers or flyers, but your chairs are numbered. So believe me, I will know. Essentially, it's just 1 to 16. So.
And the winner is 57.
57. So that is in the back row. 3 from the end, which that looks like Harriet Walker. All right. Thank you for doing that. And John says he's going to speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, maybe 45 tops, and then we'll have a good half an hour or more for a Q&A. So please join me in welcoming John Ibbitson.
Well, thank you, Alan, but how on earth am I going to live up to that hype? Indeed, I might talk even less than Alan suggested, because this is a very knowledgeable group, and I'm hoping that you'll have lots of questions. And I find that when we get a dialogue going, that's what makes for the best evenings. Also, this is a historical society, I recognize, but there's a whole lot of history going on right now, which Daryl and I talk about in Breaking Point, which we wrote. We started it in December of last year, finished it in June of 2020. Well, we wrote it in 6 months, finishing it in June of 2025, and it came out in October, so it's fairly up to date. But we can talk about everything else, including that speech of a couple of days ago, whatever you like. And I'd like to begin, if I may, by reading to you the opening paragraphs of the Duel. On Sunday, August 21st, 1979, just before the beginning of the state funeral in the nation's capital for John George Diefenbaker, a senior official came to Prime Minister Joe Clark with the news of a bomb threat. It might be necessary to evacuate the 1,200 politicians, judges, ambassadors, and other dignitaries from Christ Church Anglican Cathedral and cancel the service. The decision was the Prime Minister's to make. Clark looked around at the rows of political eminences, both conservative and liberal. He pointed to the casket. The only person who wants us all dead is up there. Let's carry on. Like many of you, I first came to an understanding of John Diefenbaker's prime ministership when I was in my teens, because Peter Newman's Renegade in Power was in our school library, and I read it. It's a very fine and very flawed book. A very finely well written, but very flawed book. And I say flawed because although I'd had this impression of Diefenbaker through the years, during my years in journalism, I'd be researching a study on immigration and go, oh, that started on Diefenbaker's watch. Or on healthcare reform. Oh, Diefenbaker launched that. Or justice, or human rights. And found that there was actually a great deal more going on inside the Diefenbaker government than people gave that government credit for. But I didn't want in any way to diminish the achievements of Lester Pearson, who was a very fine prime minister, and who's also had none of the deep personal demons that John Diefenbaker wrestled with. But I wanted to properly appreciate both men. And then I discovered as I was doing the research that really their lives were very much mirrored the development of Canada. They were born in small towns in the late 1800s, essentially when Canada was a self-governing colony of Great Britain. Victoria was on the throne. And they both wrestled over the disposition of nuclear forces in Canada. And the arc of their life is very much the arc of the life of the country from that time. And also, I wanted to correct an impression that I think a lot of people have, even people who do study Canadian history, at least some of them, that you know all about the First World War, and you know all about the Depression, you know all about the Second World War, you know about Centennial and about Trudeau, and nothing really happened between 1945 and 1967. But in fact, a great deal did happen between 1945 and 1967. And indeed, the Canada that Pierre Trudeau inherited as Prime Minister was the Canada that very much John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson and Louis Saint Laurent constructed. He inherited, and we live in, the Canada that they put together. And then it was also just such a good story. The two men hate each other. And the arc of the contest, the 10 years that they fought each other in election after election after election is just a good tale to tell. And so that's what launched me into writing The Duel. And I thank you for coming on this very snowy Ottawa night, just happens to be in Toronto, to hear about that story. Both men, as I mentioned, were born in small southern Ontario towns. Diefenbaker was the son of a teacher, and Pearson was the son of a preacher. And they moved from town to town as one got another school or one got another parish, until the break came when the Diefenbaker family left Ontario for Saskatchewan when Diefenbaker was 8. His father was, to be honest, a bit of a failed teacher, and when he became a farmer, he ended up being a rather failed farmer as well. And eventually, the Diefenbakers were moved to Saskatchewan so that the father could get a job and John could finish his high school in Saskatoon. During all those same years, Pearson was moving from parish to parish and establishing what would become one of his great traits. He learned how to get along with people. Every few years, it was a new school, new friends, new sports, and he just developed a natural ability to fit in and to be trusted by whoever he was with. Both of them had remarkably similar experiences in the First World War. Both of them were commissioned as lieutenants, and both were invalided out of the service. Neither one of them ever fought. And both of them came up with tales for why they didn't fight. But in fact, they probably both had some form of nervous breakdown and were sent back to Canada because they simply weren't in any shape to go to the front. And I think over the years they came to believe the stories they told themselves or others about what had actually happened during the war. And in fact, I know that, I believe it, because Diefenbaker kept his diary when I was out of the archives at the University of Saskatchewan, and it was perfectly clear from the diary that he was not hit by an entrenching tool, which was his excuse, but that there was something going on with him. Diefenbaker was the first to get his name in the papers. After returning to Canada and getting a law degree, he began to practice criminal law, first in the village of Waka and then in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, where he quickly became provincially known and ultimately even nationally known as a great crusading criminal attorney. He was also a man who championed the rights and of those who were being unfairly prosecuted by the judicial system. And it was genuine. This was a man who would sit in a jail cell as a woman sobbing told her about why she had dropped and her baby had died and then she had buried the baby. He worked with Indigenous defendants. He worked sometimes not to get an acquittal, but to prevent people who were being sentenced to be executed to convert it to a life sentence. He was genuine in that. He formed a genuine bond with the people that he worked with and for, and with the people of Saskatchewan, who came to appreciate that John Diefenbaker for the defense, as he was known, was a champion of their causes and their needs. But he made an incredibly politically stupid decision. He decided to run as a progressive conservative in Saskatchewan. And in those years, as Diefenbaker liked to joke, the only thing protecting conservatives in Saskatchewan were the game laws. So he managed to lose 5 consecutive elections, provincially, municipally, and federally, before finally getting into the House of Commons in 1940 as a progressive conservative MP, the first from Saskatchewan, where he proceeded to alienate the leadership of the party as thoroughly as he alienated liberals in Saskatchewan. He wasn't a man who got along well with people who were comfortable with power. He didn't like the Bay Street Boys. He didn't like the upper crust of the Progressive Conservative Party, which seemed quite content to just lose election after election after election, but served the interests of Bay Street and James Street. During those years, Lester Pearson started out as a rather indifferent professor of history at the University of Toronto, and as a very fine sports coach. He was a great athlete as a hockey player, and especially in baseball. And it looked as though the University of Toronto was going to ask him to take over the program, the athletics program, for the university. But at the same time, just as he was about to make that shift, he met O.D. Skelton. Skelton, who had formerly been the principal of Queen's, had been tasked by Mackenzie King with creating the first true Department of External Affairs, because only after 1932 that Canada had a functioning Department of External Affairs that represented the country rather than relying on Britain to do it for them. And Skelton was very impressed with Pearson, hired him along with a band of people who would all become incredibly experienced and distinguished diplomats. Pearson, again, found that they could trust Pearson to keep secrets, to mend fences, to build bridges, both in the High Commission in London and then later during the Second World War in the embassy in Washington. And in fact, he rose to become the most senior diplomat in the country, converting from the position of Undersecretary for External Affairs to the Minister, the Secretary of External Affairs. Whereas, you know, during the 1956 Suez Crisis, he was the one who brokered the idea of a ceasefire and of a peacekeeping force to keep the warring sides apart, for which in 1956 he won the Nobel Prize. And everyone assumed at that point that he was going to be the next prime minister. But fate intervened, starting in the form of a pipeline. And again, this group will know about the 1956 pipeline debate. The Saint Laurent government was determined, and C.D. Howe, the Minister of Everything, were determined to plow a natural gas pipeline through Northern Ontario, more or less at the taxpayers' expense. The Conservatives fought it tooth and nail, and eventually the Liberal government imposed closure in order to force the passage of the bill at a time when closure was an almost unheard of action for a government to take. We got the pipeline, the Trans-Canada Pipeline, but the Liberals were badly embarrassed during that debate, though they seemed quite confident that they would still win the next election. At the same time, just as that debate was ending, the leader, George Drew of the Progressive Conservative Party, became seriously ill, and his doctor said, "You have to retire immediately or you're not going to live more than 6 months." So Drew very reluctantly retired, and for a moment, the power brokers had lost their control of the Progressive Conservative Party. They couldn't just put in the next person that they wanted to see. There was a delegated convention. And at that delegated convention, John Diefenbaker was appointed leader. But it was all right. So no need to worry. We'll lose the next election. We always do. Diefenbaker will be gone, and we can put one of our boys in who will be more acceptable to us. Except when the election of 1957 was called, Diefenbaker surprised everyone by winning a minority government. So suddenly, after decades of unbroken liberal power, the Progressive Conservatives had a minority government. And they were able, after a few months, to convert it into the largest majority government in Canada's history. That period from 1957 or 1958 up until 1961, I think can be considered the great period of achievements. Indeed, if Diefenbaker had stepped down at the end of 1961, he would be remembered in history as one of Canada's most successful prime ministers. So what did he do during all of those years? Well, let's look at immigration to start. Immigration the Immigration Department of the Government of Canada had one purpose, and that was to keep Canada white. It has been said that the most racist place in Canada was the Department of Immigration. And it made sure that the people who came in were from, if possible, Britain, if absolutely necessary, from Southern or Eastern Europe, or even the United States, but not from anywhere else. Diefenbaker had all his life been discriminated against because he was German, believe it or not. And he was determined to put an end to this race-based discrimination inside the Immigration Department. And so he appointed Ellen Fairclough, the first woman cabinet minister, by the way, to clean it up. It took her pretty much the entire second term because she essentially had to fire all the senior ranks of the department and bring in new people. But in early 1962, she rose in the House of Commons and said that from this point forward, I now quote her, "Any suitably qualified person from any part of the world can be considered for immigration to Canada entirely on his own merits without regard to his race, color, national origin, or the country from which he comes. Henceforth, she promised Canada would select its immigration without discrimination of any kind." And so the beginning of the end of race-based immigration in Canada started under Ellen Fairclough and the Diefenbaker government. Another key reform is in the area of health. The Saint Laurent government had passed legislation that would one day, in theory at least, allow provincial governments to use federal funds to create public hospital care. But the bill was passed in the waning hours of the government, and it was so fraught with conditions that the Premier said that no province could ever meet the conditions that the Saint Laurent government had imposed upon it. When Diefenbaker won his minority government, one of his first acts was to simply legislate national universal hospital care. From that point on, anybody who went to a hospital in Canada would be treated at that hospital for free. This was a huge advance. Tommy Douglas had already instituted universal public hospital care in Saskatchewan as Premier, so he took the money and implemented universal public health care, the Medicare that we have today. As we all know, it started in Saskatchewan. Diefenbaker didn't feel he had a mandate to go to universal public health care. He hadn't campaigned on it. So he felt he needed some kind of justification. And so he appointed his good friend, Emmett Hall, to a healthcare commission. He had known Emmett Hall since they were lawyers back at school. And Hall and Douglas and Diefenbaker all knew each other, were all friends. And Diefenbaker knew exactly what Hall was going to do. He was going to recommend national public Medicare. And if Diefenbaker had stayed on and won the 1963 election, then it would have been Diefenbaker who implemented the Hall Commission's report. Instead, Pearson won, and it was Pearson who implemented the report. But there you see a continuum of progress in the field of healthcare from the one government to the next. You also saw it in justice. Of course, Diefenbaker was very keen on judicial reform. There was a wave of new national prisons that were much more humane than the prisons had been there before. There was a greater degree of leniency and adaptability in sentencing. And Pearson, when he became Prime Minister, carried those reforms on, eventually eliminating capital punishment entirely. Another area was in the area of human rights. Diefenbaker had championed the notion of a Bill of Rights since the time of the Second World War, when he fought on behalf of Japanese Canadians who were going to be deported from Canada after the war was over, even though most of them had been born as Canadian citizens. When he became Prime Minister, he made the cause of a Bill of Rights the most important cause of his government. And indeed, the Bill of Rights that he passed in 1960 was landmark legislation. And we all know the famous quote, but I'll repeat it anyway, in which at the introduction of the bill, he said in the House, "I am a Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship God in my own way, free to stand for what I think is right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and for all mankind." Now, the Supreme Court ultimately struck down much of that bill, which was regrettable. But as now retired Justice Rosie Abella said, it was John Diefenbaker who put the notion of human rights in the Constitution in the debate, on the map. And Pierre Trudeau, who was actually very fond of John Diefenbaker, the two of them got along quite well, was also grateful that Diefenbaker had started the debate that led to, finally, the entrenchment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Canada Act. But it was not just the Bill of Rights. He also secured voting rights for First Nations. Up until Diefenbaker's government, members of First Nations did not have the right to vote. He delivered that vote at the federal level. He also played a landmark role in opposing apartheid. In the late 1950s, the future of the South African government within the Commonwealth was under debate. And the white governments essentially wanted to find a way to keep South Africa in without getting India and the other emerging Commonwealth members too angry. Diefenbaker broke with the other old dominions and stood with the other members of the Commonwealth in opposing the admission of South Africa, which then angrily withdrew its application. The British and Australian and New Zealand prime ministers were furious with Diefenbaker for doing this. But when Nelson Mandela in 1990 came to Parliament to thank Canada for its steadfast opposition to apartheid, in the House of Commons, he thanked Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, quote, who has continued along the path charted by Prime Minister Diefenbaker, who acted against apartheid because he knew that no person of conscience could stand aside as a crime against humanity was being committed. So as I said, if at that point John Diefenbaker had, for some strange reason, decided to call it quits, it would have been a great run. Unfortunately, he was then brought down by 3 acts, all of which in which his government was right, and all of which he completely botched. He was right to cancel the Avro Arrow. It made no sense to have a continental fighter in an age where it was. In fact, the day the Arrow was launched was the day that Sputnik was revealed. Was the day that Sputnik was launched, the exact day. And clearly, ICBMs were going to be the way that nuclear missiles were delivered. In fact, the Saint Laurent government decided that it was going to cancel the Arrow contract, but decided to delay the announcement until after the 1957 election. So that it was Diefenbaker who was handed the file. He should have canceled it immediately. Instead, he took a year. By the time he finished it, he was covered with opprobrium. To this day, there are people who think that one of his great crimes was canceling the Arrow. No, his great crime is not canceling the Arrow quicker. He also got into a tremendous fight with the governor of the Bank of Canada, James Coyne. He was right. Coyne was trying to impose a monetary policy that was directly at odds with the fiscal policy of the government, but he should have just been allowed to run out his term and the new one to be appointed. Instead, Diefenbaker fired him. Coyne got onto this great crusade, and by the time he finally resigned, he was the hero, and the Diefenbaker government was clearly the villain. And then finally, there was the issue of the Beaumark missiles. The Diefenbaker government had initially agreed, after canceling the Arrow, to replace it with anti-airplane missiles, the Beaumark anti-missile system, which were to be nuclear-tipped. But then Diefenbaker became increasingly reluctant at the idea of putting nuclear weapons on Canadian soil, and he wouldn't refuse to, and he wouldn't accept nuclear-tipped missiles for the Beaumarks. And the Kennedy government was so angry that they campaigned for Pearson in 1963 as effectively as Pearson campaigned for Pearson in 1963. Diefenbaker said in 1963, I'm not running against the Liberals, I'm running against the Americans. And to a large extent, he was right. Nonetheless, these were all politically disastrous mistakes. Good policy decisions, but politically disastrous mistakes. And Lester Pearson, who was a much better politician than Diefenbaker, recognized the situation and reversed the Liberal opposition and said that they would accept the Beaumarks, and won the 1963 election as a result. Now, this makes it sound as though Pearson is simply sort of an add-on to things that happened during Diefenbaker's time. Not at all. The 5 years of Pearson's government were 5 of the most activist years of government that we've ever seen. He took the healthcare, hospital care, public hospital care reforms that Diefenbaker had implemented and extended them with the Hall Report to universal public care. He conducted a masterful series of negotiations to create the Canada Pension Plan. Diefenbaker had enhanced pensions, but he had lacked the ability to get all 10 provinces to agree to the CPP or to the Quebec equivalent, the QPP. He took Ellen Fairclough's declaration in Parliament and said, policy isn't enough. We're going to create an entirely new system, and he established the points system, which became the basis of multiculturalism and of the most enlightened immigration policy, I would contend, in the world up until just a few years ago. These were all terrific accomplishments of the Pearson government. And there was another thing. He was just a much nicer man. Although he had a cabinet rebellion of his own to deal with, he was well liked by his peers within Parliament and around the country. Although, if you were living through those years, you would have certainly heard about Pearson's achievements, but you would have heard more about Pearson's scandals. It was the most scandal-plagued government you could imagine. We just don't do scandals like we used to anymore. You talk about some of the scandals in the Pearson government, and it makes your eyes water at the corruption that was going on. Not Pearson himself ever, but people around him. There were also two major areas in which Pearson understood the country and Diefenbaker didn't. Diefenbaker kept championing one Canada. There can only be one policy for all of the country, regardless of French or English or West or Center or East. Pearson understood that there are at least two Canadas, a French and an English, and probably more like 4 or 5 Canadas in different regions with different ethnic groups. And he essentially was the father of asymmetricalism, in which federal policies are tailored in different jurisdictions following different priorities. And you may not like asymmetricalism. I love it, as a matter of fact. But it is Pearson's achievement that brought it in. Secondly, he understood that, and Diefenbaker could never understand this, that Canada had to finally withdraw from the British Empire, which was in final and permanent decline, and stand more as its own nation. And so he introduced the Canadian flag. Diefenbaker fought that flag tooth and nail. He fought it so long and so hard that his own caucus eventually rebelled against him and voted with the government to establish the flag. When the flag was raised on Parliament Hill, Diefenbaker wept, but he was wrong. He lost that fight, and he deserved to lose that fight. And finally, I would say, because I want to get through this, as I said, as quickly as I can so we can get to talking, Pearson was a modest man who knew when to speak, when to remain silent, when to stay, when to leave. His departure as Prime Minister, paving the way for Pierre Trudeau, was a model of how a Prime Minister should leave his office. In fact, I think I could safely say that Pearson was the last Prime Minister to decide to leave office rather than having the decision made for him one way or another. Diefenbaker, in contrast, could never give up power and had to have it taken away from him by his own party long after he should have stepped down. But there was a bond between Diefenbaker and the people that Pearson could never match. And I started this talk by quoting to you from the opening paragraphs of the Duel, and I'd like to finish it by quoting you from the final paragraphs of the Duel. On a warm September evening in 1967, I entered the room of my grandmother's house in Gravenhurst, Ontario, to find Grandma and my mum in front of a black and white television set, shaking their heads in distress. I asked what was wrong. They said the most terrible thing was happening to John Diefenbaker. Who was John Diefenbaker? He was a great leader, they told me. He had been our Prime Minister. Every time he spoke, it was an inspiration, the equal of Winston Churchill. And now these awful men were betraying him, forcing him out as leader of the Conservative Party. The three of us watched the balloting that Saturday. I was 12 and knew nothing about politics, but I knew how upset Mum and Grandma were over Diefenbaker's defeat in the 67 Leadership Convention, though they were no more political than typical working-class women of their time. They worshipped him. They were the sort of people who would have been thrilled had he shaken their hand while mainstreaming during an election campaign, who were inspired by his vision of one Canada, who wept with him when they lowered the Union Jack, who would have stood silently at the crossing if the funeral train had rumbled through their town. Perhaps John A. Macdonald had that bond with Canadian people, perhaps Wilfrid Laurier, but no one else before John Diefenbaker and none since. The powerful of both parties may have despised him, but the common folk loved him, and he never betrayed that love. So that ends the formal part of the talk. Now let's get to talking. And we've got, about 40 minutes, so we have about 20 minutes left. I would love to hear anything you would like to ask about the Duel, or anything you'd like to ask about anything else that's going on in the world today.
All right. Well, first of all, let's have a round of applause for the presentation. Thank you very much, John. I have two announcements that I'm going to save just to remind. I'm saying it out loud now to remind myself before I ask James to thank John, but I've got two announcements at the end. But I will ask the first question, and then we've got lots of time for audience questions. So the question, I thought you might mention something about it, but I'll give you the chance now. There's some very entertaining stories, I guess, about the relationship between John Diefenbaker and John F. Kennedy, and about Lester Pearson and Lyndon Johnson. So, and I wondered if you could comment on that a bit, and then feel free to, make the obvious connection to more recent times, if you like.
Absolutely. Diefenbaker got along fine with Eisenhower. They both liked to fly fish, or to fish, and they were both of the same age. But Diefenbaker, Camelot, was young and full of itself and full of confidence, and John F. Kennedy took an instant and strong dislike to Diefenbaker, as he continually called him. And then, as the Diefenbaker government refused to implement the Bullmark missile program, and as Diefenbaker refused to fully commit to going to DEFCON 3 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy became determined to see the end of Diefenbaker, and he even gave his pollster, Lou Harris, to the Liberal Party to help work on making Pearson more electable. In fact, there's a wonderful anecdote in the book, and I'll end with this. Pearson this was a 63 election, and Pearson, I think he was out west in Saskatchewan, and he was at a Legion Hall, and a small town, and just about to give his speech, when the janitor came up to him and said, Mr. Pearson, there's a phone call for you from the White House. And Diefenbaker, appalled, nonetheless went down to the basement, and it was a Canadian journalist, saying that John F. Kennedy wanted to pass along some advice to him. Lester Pearson's strong advice was, stop calling me, because if word ever got out that the White House was phoning Diefenbaker at a Legion Hall in Saskatchewan, it would not have been good for Pearson. And Pearson, indeed, was determined to repair relations between Canada and the United States, and indeed he got along famously with John F. Kennedy. Though we can talk about Walter Gordon's budget, if you like, which Kennedy didn't like very much. But he made the terrible mistake during a speech during the Vietnam War, in which he suggested that the Johnson government might want to suspend its bombing campaign in order to advance peace talks. He then went and met with Pearson, Johnson, who was so furious, he picked him up by the lapels and shook him and said, "You pissed on my rug." So Diefenbaker certainly had a bad relationship with John F. Kennedy, but at least he was never physically assaulted by the the American president. So they both ended up equally badly in the relationships with their presidents.
All right. So questions for John, please. Can you give me a show of hands of who would like to ask a question? We've got two in the front row. I'll start with Gordon Henderson.
You mentioned Peter Newman and Renegade in Power, but he also wrote this Temper of Our Times. Mm-hmm. And I look back on the 60s and think, there were so many achievements. But why would he call it that?
Peter Newman always fell into and out of love with Canadian prime ministers. That went all the way to Mulroney. If you remember, one of the last books he did, I think the last book he did, was to publish the secret tapes that he had made with Mulroney, and he had promised Mulroney that he would never release them until after Mulroney had died. And then, having a problem with alimony, decided to release them anyway. It has been said of Newman that there was always a politician on the horizon that he championed, and then once they were in office, he proceeded to turn on them. And that was true of Mulroney and Trudeau as much as it was of Pearson and Diefenbaker.
Okay, from Lynn MacDonald.
Thank you. Very interesting. I wonder if you would go back to the 1960 Diefenbaker Bill of Rights. The Saskatchewan had a Bill of Rights in 1947, thanks to Tommy Douglas, and that's even a year before the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. But I wonder if the Tommy Douglas, albeit provincial, Bill of Rights had any influence, or what kind of influence, on Diefenbaker.
It's certainly safe to say that as I said, that he and Emmett Hall and Diefenbaker all came out of the same tradition. The populist, it was not really conservative, populist tradition in Saskatchewan. that led to Tommy Douglas becoming premier and ultimately Diefenbaker becoming prime minister and Hall becoming the author of Medicare. Diefenbaker had a notoriously faulty memory. He maintained that he opposed the internment of Japanese Canadians at the start of the Second World War. He didn't. There's nothing on the record in which he opposes the internment. But at the end of the war, this was before the 47 Bill of Rights in Saskatchewan, the Canadian government, and by the way, James, what's it called? Something Exile. I reviewed it for the Globe and Mail. It's a wonderful book, and you must get it, and I must remember it. It just came out a few months ago about the federal government's decision to expel Japanese Canadians from Canada and return them to Japan, most of whom had never even been to Japan. They were told they had a choice. They could not stay in British Columbia. They could either go east or they could go back to Japan. And about 40% of them, probably not knowing what it was they were agreeing to, said back to Japan, and then realized what it actually meant, and then asked to have that changed. They went to the Supreme Court of Canada and ultimately the Privy Council to defend the government's right to do that. And about 4,000 Canadians, many of them children who'd never seen Japan in their life, who spoke no Japanese, found themselves in a war-ravaged post-war Japan. Diefenbaker fought that, and he fought it hard. And while he was fighting it, he first proposed a Bill of Rights for Canadians so that governments could not capriciously suspend the rights of Canadians. So that predated Tommy Douglas's legislation, but it would all have been a piece, right? It would have come out of the same air, the same soil of that time. Challenging exile, yes. I think one of the best history books that has been published in Canada in several years, James, of course, being the honorable exception.
All right, our next question is at the back from Patrice Dutil.
Thanks. Thank you, John, for this presentation. We often forget that what made Diefenbaker in 58, because he lost the popular vote in 57 to Louis Saint-Laurent, who is actually the innovator of all these things and who is a real maker of modern Canada, but we'll have a fight after that. The relationship with Quebec of both men. Diefenbaker won in 58 because of Quebec. He had I'd like to hear your comments on that relationship, but then Pearson's relationship with Quebec. Fundamentally different.
And is this the first time we've met Professor Dutil? Because we have talked many times on the phone. Unbidden, I will say I don't think I respect any political scientist in the country more than I respect Professor Dutil, and I have leaned on him far too many times in my journalism. Diefenbaker won in Quebec because good Lord, yes, but Duplessis. Thank you. I'm an old man now. Names escape me. Duplessis saw that Diefenbaker was doing well in other parts of the country, and that the Conservatives had a real shot at winning the election. And in the 57 election, he didn't put the Union Nationale on the side of the Conservatives, but he did help them in, I think, 10 ridings, which contributed to the minority government. And then he did turn the machine on for Diefenbaker in the 58 election. But of course, he turned on the machine because he saw that English Canada was overwhelmingly going to vote for Diefenbaker, and he wanted French Canada to as well. Pearson had a much better understanding of the Quiet Revolution that succeeded that. I'll just very quickly tell the story about the CPP. So Pearson wanted to create a national pension plan. They had a First Minister's meeting in Quebec. And Johnson, the Premier, said, we're not having anything to do with your plan. Besides, it's a lousy plan. It doesn't work very well at all. It wasn't properly funded. And so we're establishing our own plan, the Quebec pension plan. And everything was in terrible state. Ontario, under John Robarts, was moving forward with its own plan. And we were going to have provincial plans, and they wouldn't be portable, and it was going to be a mess. What Diefenbaker's, Pearson's aides came to him and said, Quebec is right. Theirs is a much better plan than ours. Why don't we just go back to Quebec and say, can we adopt your plan? And they did. And in the end, the plans were so identical that the Quebec plan was used as the translation from the English-Canadian plan into French. Pearson talked down John Robarts and said, for the sake of the country, you have to fold in with the national plan, and Robarts finally agreed. But those were his finest months as Prime Minister, if you ask me. I don't think he ever understood what Quebec wants, but he understood that Quebec had to be heard and had to be accommodated. And in the most ambitious legislative program of his prime ministership, the CPP, he did a splendid job of corralling all of those premiers and getting them to agree to the plan that we have today.
Thank you. Next question is from Joanne Archibald.
Hi, thank you so much for this great talk. I'm glad you mentioned the Louis Saint Laurent connection. My question is about the military. So I wonder if you could speak a bit about how Diefenbaker and Pearson dealt with Canadian military issues differently or similarly, and how that changed the way that they interacted with Canadians.
Great question. Diefenbaker, in many ways, was felled by the military. Again, the Saint Laurent government had been negotiating with the Eisenhower government to establish a North American air defense plan. The plan had been agreed to, but had not announced. And so when Diefenbaker became prime minister in 57, one of the first things that happened was generals came to him and said, we have this NORAD plan. You need to sign off on it because the Americans are impatient and want to get it out. Diefenbaker did without really understanding what it was he was signing. And so when the Beaumont missile crisis came along, it came along because the American and Canadian militaries both wanted the Beaumarks, and Diefenbaker was becoming increasingly resistant to the Beaumarks. So it was the military as much as the Liberals and the Americans who helped to bring Diefenbaker down. Pearson on the military. I can't think of anything other than when the crisis in Cyprus was at its peak. Johnson asked Pearson if Canada could send troops to Cyprus, and they could, and they did. And you know how they got there? They got there on Canada's aircraft carrier, the HMCS Bonaventure. People don't understand how far the military has declined, but it declined under Trudeau. And indeed, as I talk about in the book, Trudeau's big foreign defense policy paper appalled Pearson, who wrote frantically in the margins, this is all wrong and no, don't do it. But he kept quiet because he was a team player. But he left Trudeau a robust Canadian military, including a robust Canadian Navy, which Trudeau then began to dismantle.
All right, another question here at the back.
So I grew up in Vancouver listening to Morningside as a teenager, and of course there was Mr. Cairns, Mr. Lewis, and Dalton Camp.
Right.
They were all very entertaining. So my question is the coup d'etat, for lack of a better word, that Dalton Camp launched against Diefenbaker. How much has that proved to be a blueprint for the removal of political leaders across Canada since?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I hadn't thought about it. By the way, that I very well remember that allegedly one NDP, one Liberal, and one Conservative. They were all so identical that it was ludicrous to believe that you were hearing three different perspectives. Camp was more liberal than most Liberals. I cannot say with any degree of certainty. Certainly the fact that a political party, we can say that internal rebellion within a political party brought about the forced removal of the leader of that party at the national level for the very first time. I think it was the very first time. So the tradition of rebellion within the party to bring down a leader certainly started with Diefenbaker, and we'll see in a couple of days how it ends.
All right, two more questions on this side.
Thank you.
And this poor fellow too.
it's hard to think of these two politicians without thinking of George Grant's Lament for a Nation. And I'm wondering, I was thinking about this this morning when I read Mark Carney's address at Davos, and I wonder if you could think of whether there's a line between George Grant's Lament for a Nation and what Carney was talking about
That's
this
interesting.
morning.
We talk about Lament for a Nation, by the way, in Breaking Point. And we also talk about it briefly in the Duel. But the backstory, as far as the Duel is concerned, is that George Grant was a university student in England in the early years of the war. And not John English, but other biographers of Pearson believed that Pearson had an affair with someone that Grant was very close to. And then dumped her. And Grant was furious with Pearson. And the Lament for a Nation was as much an attempt to get back at Pearson for his scandalous behavior in London as it was anything else. The evidence for that is secondary. And I think in the Duel I simply say, John English doesn't mention it, but others do, and I shrug.
All right, next question from Joe Martin and then David Raymond.
I would say that both Mannion and Bracken were basically removed by the party, and Bracken was even given a farm, which I'm sure he appreciated. And the other thing I would say is, I've just been thinking of this recently about the Big Blue Machine, and perhaps this is a digression, but somebody should look at their record on before Bill Davis co-opted them and choosing candidates for leadership. And remember, they were 4 Al Lords. And imagine what would have happened to Ontario if that had happened. And we know what happened with Stanfield. Just a thought.
Yeah, but an interesting thought. You're absolutely right, of course, and I'd forgotten. I talk about Bracken being torpedoed by the party. And in fact, John Diefenbaker was appalled by how Bracken was treated, and he had Bracken sitting beside him at the convention where he was made leader. But of course, you're absolutely right about the party brass bringing down Bracken.
I was just wondering, when you listed some of the achievements of Lester Pearson, there was one I was thinking that has also a fairly significant impact on the development of Canada, and I believe Pearson was fairly much a leader in developing the federal public service as a bilingual service, so that French Canadians knew that they could now find a place that had normally been run by Scotsmen and Englishmen.
That's true. It's also a bit of a continuum. Diefenbaker introduced translation into the House of Commons. Prior to Diefenbaker, if a French politician, a French MP stood up and began speaking in French, the English MP just walked out. So Diefenbaker established simultaneous translation. But then again, Pearson took that much farther towards creating a more bilingual public service, which Trudeau then further entrenched. But I think it would be fair to say that, again, that was part of Pearson's recognition that things were happening in Quebec, and that Quebec had to be accommodated, an accommodation that Diefenbaker would never support because he did not believe in different treatment for different parts of the country. Again, a place where Pearson was right and Diefenbaker was wrong.
Okay, next question here in the front row.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a question about why you think that the NDP pretty much single-handedly gets credit for Canadian healthcare, and notwithstanding the efforts both by the Conservatives and the Liberals, as well as an effort in 1919 by the federal Liberals to bring in healthcare that was stymied by constitutional challenges from the provinces. What's as a piece of sort of cultural history, how did the NDP how did the Conservatives and the Liberals pretty much get written out of the credit for a healthcare system that Canadians value the way we do?
I would not necessarily completely agree with the premise of the question. I think, wasn't there a contest for the most respected Canadian, and Tommy Douglas was the winner? And the reason Tommy Douglas was the winner was that it was widely understood that he introduced universal public health care to Canada in Saskatchewan. He fought the doctors in the doctors' strike. He won that strike. And I think it's very much, if you were talking about the father of Medicare, you would probably have to say that he was the father of Medicare. But again, it was all of a piece because his good buddy Emmett Hall was writing the Hall report, which Diefenbaker had commissioned and which Pearson then implemented. It's that kind of a country, isn't it? For example, it was the Diefenbaker government that committed Canada to Expo 67, and it was the Pearson government that cut the ribbon. It was the Saint Laurent government that committed Canada to the St. Lawrence Seaway. It was the Diefenbaker government that cut the ribbon. Especially in those years, there was a very broad consensus on policy, both among Republicans and Democrats in the United States, and between progressive conservatives and liberals and governing, they would have been CCP, in Saskatchewan at the time. You didn't have the deep ideological divisions that emerged, starting with Trudeau essentially, and leading to today.
All right, Jerry Friesen.
Professor Friesen.
My question, is this working? No, can you turn it off? Great. No. Is it working?
Yes, I can hear it.
What's been handed down to me over the years is the chaos in Diefenbaker's office and cabinet. That's the myth that has circled for all the decades since. What's your sense of that?
Well, it's true. There was a chaotic office, principally run by his secretary, Bunny, but he was terrible at records. Things were always just all over the desk. He lost one major international document at one point. But it also has to be mentioned that Pearson suffered cabinet rebellions as well. Did any prime minister up until Justin Trudeau have so many cabinet ministers writing scathing memoirs of their times as Pearson did? Judy LaMarche, The Bird in the Gilded Cage, and his principal secretary. No, that's Coots was Trudeau. His principal secretary, whose name again escapes me, wrote a memoir that was not very flattering, and so did his finance minister. Write a portrait that wasn't very flattering. So Pearson had his own demons in cabinet as well. Also, he was not very organized. Also, neither one of them knew the first thing about economics. Another continuum.
Okay, I think what is going to be our last question is from our chair of the CIHE, Don Cranston.
So just have asked for a few comments, sir, on the current state of current affairs today between Canada and our neighbor to the south.
Yeah, you thought it was bad with Diefenbaker and Pearson. See what it's like now. Though in my career, I arrived in Parliament Hill in 2002, and in my career, every prime minister, starting with Paul Martin, said that he was going to repair the relationship with the United States that had been left in such a terrible disrepair by his predecessor. And invariably, at the time the prime minister left, the situation was even worse with the Americans than it was when he started. And that was also true of Stephen Harper, and certainly true of Justin Trudeau. We have, in Breaking Point, we say that a prime minister has three jobs. Keep the shop running, keep the country together, and handle the Americans. Every prime minister has had the job of handling the Americans, and none of them have had a clear run at it. I would say Eisenhower was the last prime minister who could say he had good relations with both Canadian prime ministers.
And anything about the current situation and Mark Carney? And
I'm only going to say this. I mean, I thought the speech was amazing too, and I agree with every word of it. I said as much on Twitter, X or whatever. The only thing I would say about the current situation between Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney, and it doesn't just apply to Mr. Poilievre, it applies to the growth in Canadian populism. Well, Stephen Harper was not a populist conservative, but certainly Preston Manning was, and Doug Ford is, and Pierre Poilievre is. And the first of them was John Diefenbaker. But John Diefenbaker was a populist because he was one of the people that he represented. He was the son of a failed farmer. He was an attorney who would represent people in distress without fee. He lived among them, understood them, and championed their causes and governed on behalf of them. So his populism was rooted in his life. I think we have to ask ourselves, to what extent is the populism of today the product of the life of the politician, or to what extent is it just a politician trying to exploit the people?
All right, thank you. I've got two. I have two announcements before I'll ask James Stewart to thank John. The first is to do with the next event in being put on by the Canadian Institute for Historical Education, and that is a play that has been commissioned and written by Gordon Henderson, who is with us in the front row here, and he also stars as Dr. Ryerson in the play. So this is on Sunday afternoon, February 8th at 2 p.m., The Trial of Edgerton Ryerson, and it's down at the Arts and Letters Club. Tickets are only $25. There are only 100 seats, actually I think 108, but there are less than 30 tickets left. So if you are interested in a ticket, there's just the Sunday afternoon, the one performance by the CIHE. Go to the website, cihe.ca, and you can get your tickets there, but act fast. The second announcement is that we have, as I mentioned before, copies of the Duel and also of the book with Daryl Bricker. And I want to thank Allison and Jeffrey, who are our local booksellers from Book City. So please welcome them and support your local bookseller. So with that, I will call on James Stewart.
It's definitely a great honor for me to thank John for the talk today. And I'll just tell you a little anecdote that John probably won't realize, but we've been correspondents by email for close to 30 years. And this goes back to the days when you were with the Queen's Park bureau chief at the Globe and Mail. And so we would go back and forth with our correspondence. And, he even read a chapter of my recent book on, he read the Diefenbaker and the Pearson chapter. So I'm very, and the Harper chapter. So let's not forget that you have a book on Stephen Harper as well. Probably in 2021 or so, I would email John and say, what project are you working on? And he said, I'm working on a dual biography, Diefenbaker and Pearson. And I got pretty excited about it. And you can see why, because Diefenbaker and Pearson, as John has told us today, have made indelible imprints on the nation. And I think we can all agree in this room, and it was interesting in the pre-chat scuttlebutt, the number of people here who have actually met John Diefenbaker. I met one person, I think it was Gordon Walker, who had breakfast with him. Gordon Henderson, who had breakfast with him. Gordon Walker and his wife Harriet had Diefenbaker for dinner. So everyone seems to have, it's like 6 degrees of John Diefenbaker. So these are prime ministers that have made a big impact on the nation, and we're a better country when we know more about our history, when we know who the leaders are that have made decisions that, it didn't just start with Pierre Trudeau, or it actually goes back further into our history, and it helps us understand the country better. John has done a great job of telling those stories through his journalism, but also through his books. And so on behalf of everyone here today, John, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, James. Thanks, everyone.
And after 30 years of emails, it's great to shake your hand.
Yeah, it is.
Off to the book signing table, I guess, now, for anyone who wants to get a book over there.